Overthinking is not a thinking problem. It is a trust problem. And until you understand that distinction, no productivity system, no time management app, no breathing technique is going to fix it. That is what today is about. Most overthinkers are some of the most intelligent, most capable, most driven people in any room. They see every angle. They anticipate every outcome. They run every scenario before the conversation even begins. And from the outside, that looks like thoroughness, like diligence, like someone who cares. But from the inside, and every overthinker knows this, it is exhausting, it is paralyzing, and it is costing them far more than they realize. In the corporate world, overthinking does not just affect the individual, it spreads. A leader who cannot make a decision without running it through 50 mental filters creates a team that waits. A team that waits creates a culture of hesitation. A culture of hesitation loses ground to competitors, to opportunity, to the kind of bold, clear action that actually moves things forward. Overthinking is not a personal quirk. In an organization, it is a performance issue. So where does it come from? From a psychology standpoint, overthinking is the mind's attempt to create certainty in an uncertain world. The brain, which is wired for survival, treats ambiguity as a threat. And when it perceives a threat, it does what it has always done. It analyzes. It searches for more information. It runs more scenarios. It tries to think its way to safety. The problem is that in most professional situations, there is no amount of thinking that will produce the certainty the brain is looking for. The information will never be complete. The outcome will never be guaranteed. And so the loop continues, not because you are not smart enough to figure it out, but because the brain is trying to solve an emotional problem with a cognitive tool. The mind is like water. When it is turbulent, you cannot see through it. When it is calm, everything becomes clear. Overthinking is turbulence. And the more you think, the more turbulent it gets. The answer is never more thinking. The answer is learning how to still the water. Here is something that most high performers have never been told. You are not your thoughts. You are the one noticing them. That distinction between the thought and the observer of the thought is one of the most liberating things a person can internalize. Because the moment you realize that a thought is just a thought, and not a fact, and not a command, and not a verdict on your capability or your worth, the grip loosens. The loop slows. And for the first time, there is space between the thought and the response. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is your power to choose. Overthinkers have collapsed that space. Every stimulus, every email, every decision, every piece of feedback triggers an immediate cascade of analysis, interpretation, and worst-case scenario building. The work is to rebuild that space, to widen it, to make it large enough that you can actually choose how you respond, rather than being dragged along by the momentum of your own mental noise. In the workplace, this shows up in very specific ways. The leader who rewrites the same email 12 times. The team member who cannot commit to a direction in a meeting because they are still processing every possible implication. The executive who delays a decision for weeks. Not because the information is not there, but because the mind keeps generating new reasons to wait. These are not failures of intelligence. They are failures of trust. Trust in their own judgment. Trust that imperfect action is better than perfect inaction. Trust that they are capable of handling whatever the outcome turns out to be. And that is the root of it. Underneath most overthinking is a fear, not of making the wrong decision, but of not being able to cope with the consequences of it. The overthinker does not actually believe they cannot figure out the right answer. They are afraid that even if they get it right, something will still go wrong. And if something goes wrong, they will not be okay. That belief, usually formed long before the corporate career began, often in childhood, often absorbed from an environment that rewarded perfection and punished mistakes, is what drives the loop. The thinking is not the problem. The belief underneath the thinking is the problem. This is where the real work is, not in thinking less, but in building the inner foundation that makes it safe to act. When a person genuinely trusts themselves, not blindly, not arrogantly, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who they are and what they are capable of, the overthinking naturally reduces. Because the mind is no longer trying to protect someone who feels fragile. It is simply processing information for someone who feels grounded. Practically, there are things that help. The first is the decision threshold, setting a clear point at which you commit to acting on the information you have, rather than waiting for more. In most corporate decisions, 80% of the relevant information is available within the first 24 hours. The remaining 20% rarely changes the outcome significantly. Act at 80%. The rest is usually just anxiety dressed up as diligence. The second is the body check. Before you spiral into another round of analysis, pause and check in physically. Where do you feel the tension? The chest, the shoulders, the jaw? That physical sensation is not a signal to think more. It is a signal to breathe, to regulate, to bring the nervous system back to a state where the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that actually makes good decisions, can do its job without being hijacked by the stress response. The third is the question that cuts through everything. Ask yourself, what is the actual worst case here? Not the catastrophized version, the realistic one. And then ask, could I handle that? In almost every case, the answer is yes. You have handled hard things before. You will handle them again. The mind that trusts that truth does not need to overthink. It just needs to move. The mind is a great servant, but as a master, it will run you into the ground. The overthinker has handed the keys to a servant that was never designed to drive. Reclaiming those keys, learning to observe the mind rather than be governed by it, is not just a personal breakthrough. In a corporate context, it is a leadership breakthrough. Because the leader who thinks clearly, acts decisively, and trusts their own judgment creates permission for everyone around them to do the same. Clarity is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the ability to move forward in spite of it. That is the shift, and it is available to every single person willing to make it. This is Michael Abdallah.